So I'll say one thing about context to start with. The IOF is trying to create a context for people developing new systems designed to advance exchange of data, exchange of instructions, exchange of orders, and so on between primarily manufacturing industrial organizations. The idea at the moment is that when a company wants to build some kind of digital manufacturing infrastructure, then they either build from scratch for themselves if they're very big, or they buy off the shelf if they are not so very big. If they are very big and they build themselves, they make a mess of it typically. So that I don't know of any good large-scale suite of software for digital manufacturing which any large, even a very rich company is satisfied with. They're all saying, oh, well, we're still working on it. We don't want to show it to you yet. But even if they did succeed in doing that, they would still be almost nowhere because they have to work with other organizations, their suppliers and the people they outsource manufacturing to and customers and so on. And they're going to be using different software systems anyway. And the same thing applies even more so in the case of smaller industrial organizations. Everyone feels the need to start from scratch, and I could explain why I think that is, which has something to do with the way computer science students are taught. But everyone thinks they have to start from scratch, and so nothing fits with everything else. And of course, there have been attempts along the way to solve this problem, but they've all failed. And maybe this attempt will fail. But anyway, this is an attempt to create a context in which people will have something to start with. There will be small, completely open, reusable, repurposable modules which will give you ontology content for certain areas that you need for digital manufacturing. And the modules will be expanded from time to time. They will be applied, tested, revised, but there will always be a standard product lifecycle ontology, a standard materials ontology, and so forth, which everyone can use and which will be well documented. Now, we're trying to build that context. And some of us think, and I'm still optimistic, actually, that what we think will come true, that BFO should be the top-level architecture for this collection of modules. And so I'm going to start by talking about BFO. BFO is already doing this, but on a higher level and across many more areas. So the people have thought that ontology was the key to solving the problem of failure of interoperability, and that failed too. And the reason was that every time it succeeded, people said, oh, ontology, that will solve our problems. I want one of those. And so they tell someone to go and build an ontology. And then you get another piece of interoperability failure because that ontology doesn't fit with any of the other ontology. So there is, as Ram pointed out, actually Kemper pointed out, there is one success story in all of this, and that's biology, bioinformatics. They started very early with the data from the Human Genome Project, and they created a suite of ontologies which all biologists know about and which are reused over and over again and which have had huge amounts of funding from the NIH, so that there now is a kind of de facto successful interoperability. Now, the gene ontology, which is the core of this success, was then expanded with various other ontologies, the cell ontology, the protein ontology, and so on, to create the Obo Foundry. And the Obo Foundry is the model for the IO Foundry. This is the original Obo Foundry. This is an organization which I put together along with the leaders of the gene ontology community. The gene ontology itself is in yellow, and the protein ontology and so forth are on the bottom level. The cells are on the next level, organs are on the next level, populations would be on a higher level. And we've extended it to encompass information artifacts, experiments, And we actually used the ontology of experiments as our first effort to create an ontology for industrial processes, because many of the things that you need to perform an experiment have counterparts in a factory. Now, gene ontology is in fact three ontologies. An ontology of processes, an ontology of functions, and an ontology of components. And BFO is really just a reverse engineering of the top level of the gene ontology. So there are three major kinds of entities in BFO. There are things which continue through time, such as people and planets. There are things which continue through time which depend upon people and planets, like functions, capabilities, attributes of various sorts. And then there are processes, which we call occurrence. So this is the basic picture. And we now have more than 300 initiatives which are using BFO. I think that Psych was mentioned earlier. Psych has had probably 300 customers. But Psych is, for various reasons, not in the public domain, and it's gigantic. And so it's not conceivable that something so big and so semi-secret could ever play the kind of role of creating a context which will promote interoperability of the sort which we have in mind in the IOF. Ram mentioned the book, and so for those of you who haven't seen it, this is the book he was referring to. Psych doesn't have a textbook. It doesn't have guides. And that's true of the other major ontologies. And so I think one big difference now between BFO and the other ontologies is that we really have bent over backwards, not just to build it, but also to train people in using it. We've had dozens of training sessions, initially with biologists, now more and more with military people. And we've also put all of the training material online, and now we've turned it into a kind of textbook. Now, there are various criteria which an ontology like BFO, or the ontologies as we conceive them from the IOF, have to have. They all have to be small. They have to be such that you can easily learn them. BFO has 34 nodes in a graph, which Ram showed you in his slides earlier. In the case of BFO, it has to be a top-level ontology, which means that it has to apply to all domains equally. It shouldn't contain terms like vertebrate. It has to have documentation. It has to be reviewed by aggressive, angry, critical users. And BFO has had a lot of that for many years. It has to be represented in the standard languages for OWL, for ontology work, and the OWL is the most important. I agree with Ram that that is not an ideal situation. Another logical framework which we are using more and more now is Common Logic, which is an ISO standard logical framework, which has some advantages over OWL, but also some disadvantages. You have to have natural language definitions of all the terms in your ontology, because the ontology is there to be used and criticized and extended by people, and they have to understand it. You probably need a WordNet mapping, and it should be stable, so it shouldn't be the kind of thing that gets a new version every 4 weeks. And it should have an explicit license. Now, this is crucially important in the industry case, because if we want large companies to use small pieces of software over and over again, and they're not clear about their IP commitments when they use that small piece of software, then they're not going to use it. Okay, so the idea of the OBO Foundry has not only been adopted by the IOF, it's also been taken up by various other biological communities. The United Nations Environment Program, the USGS, Federal Highway Administration. So this is the Common Reference Ontologies for plants or crop. This is the OB ontology, which I mentioned earlier. This is a list of the work which is going on in various military circles at the moment, the most important of which is the AFRL. We have the digital thread, digital twin work on an AFRL and ontology project. We also have AFRL work within the IOF on materials ontology, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later because I see there are people in the room already interested in that topic. Now, the digital thread is an example of engineering-related activities involving the creation of ontology suites like the Open Foundry. We also have a DIMD grant in Buffalo, which is working exactly along the same lines. And we also now have a project with the Jet Propulsion Lab and NASA to create something similar for systems engineering rather than industrial or manufacturing engineering. One scenario is that this effort becomes a part or a branch of the IOF. So I'm not sure how things will develop, but both of those are ongoing initiatives. Another ongoing initiative is to have BFO recognized as an ISO standard. So far things are proceeding very well, even if they're involving a lot more work than I anticipated when I started on this. So that will, if all goes well, it will be ISO 21838. Part 1 will be a specification of what a top-level ontology is, and Part 2 will be BFO, which will take the form of a demonstration that BFO conforms to the requirements set forth in Part 1. So my vision for the IOF is that it should have a hub and spokes kind of structure. Probably the people who are working on the IOF explicitly will just deal with the internal set of spokes, the spokes nearest to the hub. This might be the Airbus hub, and this might be the Boeing. Sorry, this might be the Airbus module or the Airbus sub-suite within the whole suite. And it may be that no one else ever sees this, but some of this will be proprietary. But all of this part will be open. So we don't need to deal with this now. So let me say a little bit more about the BFO, the way it's built. So as I say, it starts as a reverse engineering of the gene ontology. BFO is an ontology which has 34 nodes. Each node is an English noun or noun phrase. So independent continuant means anything which has molecules as parts, or something like a spatial region which is occupied by something which has molecules as parts. So we have not started to think about photons or quarks. So we think of independent continuants primarily at the medium-sized level of granularity of machines and tables and people. A dependent continuant is any kind of attribute of an independent continuant. Shape, temperature, color, specific gravity, and so on. And then processes are self-explanatory. The point is that all of these terms, process-dependent continuant, independent continuant, represent types of things in reality. Now, in addition to types, there are also instances. I am a thing. My temperature is an attribute. My waving my hand now is a process, and all of these go down here. And we make a clear distinction then between types which exist on the level of the general and instances which exist on the level of the spatio-temporally particular. Now, already that distinction is not clearly drawn in far too many weekend ontologies created at great expense by Northrop Grumman or somebody. Now there is a dependence relation. Attributes depend on their bearers. My temperature depends on me. You can't have my temperature. You can have an exactly similar temperature. And similarly, processes depend on our participants. So my waving my arm depends upon my arm. And we can see this in a slightly more interesting case. So a plumbing system is an independent continuum. And systems are continuants. You build them and they exist for its time. And then they work, they function in processes. And one of the things that we're building is an ontology of systems which will describe these kinds of things, and then instances will be, for instance, the plumbing system in John's house. And we already did something similar for organisms and for biological systems. We've done a lot of work like this in great detail for diseases and symptoms and treatments and the relations between diseases and molecular phenomena. Now we can apply some of that work in the engineering context. Now, there are, in fact, in BFO two kinds of attributes. There are what we call qualities, which is normally associated with things like color. On the other hand, we have realizable dependent continuance, which means that these are attributes which have a realization. They are potentialities, if you like, or tendencies, or possibilities. So, examples of realizable dependent continuance are listed here. The main category of realizable dependent continuance is dispositions. So, male adults have a disposition to go bald. They don't have a capability of going bald, but capabilities are a subkind of disposition. Something we're working on at the moment is producing a nice specification of what makes a disposition a capability. So a transport system has, if you're lucky, the capability of making a profit. But that doesn't mean it will make a profit. But it also doesn't mean that it has the function of making a profit. The function of the transport system is to transport people. So functions are a type of capability. They are, and I think we can define that already. A function is a capability which is such that the thing which bears that capability was built to have that capability. So we first of all design something. We want it to do X. We have the design. We use the design to make X. Sorry, to make the thing which will do X, and then X has the function because it was made that way. Now, there are two ways to make things. One way is by design. The other way is by evolution. So my heart has a function of pumping blood. It was built to do that by evolutionary processes. All right, so, and then every realizable dependent continuum has a certain type of process, which is its realization process. Transporting people, draining the house, and so on. And now this is a similar kind of picture for disease. So diseases are dispositions. You can have a disease without ever realizing the disposition, because your disease is dormant, or because it doesn't kick in with symptoms until after you die. Well, you're already dead anyway, from another disease. So if you like, functions are good dispositions, diseases are bad dispositions. And diseases are realized in disease courses, and every disease will be associated with multiple different kinds of disease courses, depending upon the kind of treatment which the disease is receiving. All right, now briefly to a couple more words on the IOF. So where are we with the IOF? We've had a lot of telephone meetings. We've had 2 face-to-face meetings. I'm assuming that Paul will be able to tell us about the next face-to-face meeting in NIST. And we have a number of industrial partners who take part in these meetings quite regularly. and we have a number of academic people like me who take part in these meetings, and we are observing, we are looking at possible avenues, opportunities to populate some part of the IOF. And the first step is to collect all of those possible contributions. So if you have ontologies for specific areas of manufacturing industry, then we want to see them and include them in our portal. And then the other thing we've been doing is some of us have been dividing into subgroups. For instance, Dimitris and I are part of a subgroup working on product lifecycle ontology, which is what he's going to be talking about next.